Picture this. Summer of 326 BCE. Monsoon rains hammer down on a swollen river in the Punjab, a river the locals call the Hydaspes. On one bank stands Alexander, undefeated in 8 years of war, a man who has never once lost a battle against Persia's greatest kings and generals. On the other bank stands someone completely different from anyone he has faced before. Not satrap, not a fleeing emperor. A king named Porus, 7 feet tall by some ancient accounts, standing beside 200 war elephants, the largest living weapons the ancient world had ever built an army around. For the first time in his entire campaign, Alexander is about to face an enemy commander who has absolutely no intention of running. This is the story of the Battle of the Hydaspes, the bloodiest and most costly victory of Alexander's entire career, and the battle that finally broke something inside the army that had followed him to the edge of the known world. To understand why this battle nearly stopped Alexander in his tracks, you have to understand how far he had already come. After Gaugamela shattered the Persian Empire for good, Alexander did not stop. He pushed east, through Central Asia, through brutal guerrilla campaigns in the mountains of modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, campaigns that dragged on for years and cost him more than any single battle ever had. By the time he reached India, his men had been marching, fighting, and bleeding for nearly 8 straight years, thousands of miles from home, deeper into unknown territory than any Greek army had ever gone. And now, in front of him, stood a river swollen by monsoon rains, and beyond it, an army unlike anything he had encountered in Persia. Word had reached Alexander of King Porus long before he arrived at the river bank. Porus ruled a kingdom in the Punjab, and unlike the satraps at Granicus, unlike Darius himself, he was not a man inclined to negotiate or retreat. He gathered his forces on the far bank and made his intentions brutally clear. If Alexander wanted to cross, he would have to do it under the eyes of 200 trained war elephants, alongside thousands of infantry, cavalry, and chariots built for the soaked terrain of the monsoon season. Alexander's own scouts brought back reports that stopped even his most experienced officers cold. War elephants, creatures most of the Macedonian soldiers had never seen in their lives, animals the size of small buildings, capable of trampling infantry formations, and terrifying horses that had never smelled anything like them before. A direct crossing, in daylight, in full view of an army built specifically to punish exactly that kind of assault, would be suicide. So Alexander decided to trick Porus completely. For days, he staged a visible show of preparing his army along the riverbank, marching troops back and forth, making noise, making it look as though an attack could come at any moment. Porus mirrored every movement, refusing to be caught off guard, night after night, until his soldiers grew numb to the false alarms and slowly lowered their guard. Then the monsoon turned violent. Thunder swallowed every other sound, rain collapsed visibility to almost nothing, and under that cover Alexander slipped a smaller elite force upstream, far from Porus's watching scouts, to cross where no one was looking. The current was faster than expected, and at one point his men realized they had landed on an island rather than the far bank. For a second scramble to find real ground in total darkness, an enemy army only miles away, with no idea any of this was happening. By dawn, Alexander was across, and Porus had no idea his enemy was no longer where he thought. When word reached Porus that a Macedonian force now stood on his own flank, he faced an impossible choice: fight on 2 fronts or commit fully and risk being wrong. He sent a detachment led by his own son to intercept them. It wasn't enough. Alexander's force crushed it, and Porus's son was killed. Now Porus understood the true scale of what he faced. And here, the battle turns into something Alexander had never seen before. Porus did not flee. He turned his entire army to meet the threat head-on, elephants in a long defensive line, infantry between them, cavalry on the flanks, and prepared to fight in the open. The 2 armies advanced across mud, turned to soup by days of rain. Alexander's cavalry struck first, drawing Porus's horsemen away from the protection of the elephant line with the same speed that had shattered Persian cavalry twice before. But as the infantry pushed toward the center, they met something no amount of drilling against Persia had prepared them for. The elephants surged forward. Imagine standing in that phalanx, shield locked to the man beside you, watching a wall of trumpeting giants bear down on your position. Horses reared and refused to advance no matter how hard their riders pulled, the smell alone erasing years of battle training in seconds. Alexander's cavalry, so devastating in every previous fight, suddenly counted for almost nothing. For a few terrifying minutes, the Macedonian line bent. Men who had never broken formation, not at Granicus, not at Issus, not even under the chariots at Gaugamela, found themselves being pushed backward, step by something no sarissa or shield wall had ever been built to stop. If the line failed here, if panic spread the way it had once spread through Persian ranks, there would be nothing to save the army caught between an elephant charge and a flooded river behind them. But held. Alexander had trained his soldiers for exactly this kind of crisis, discipline over instinct. Rather than break, the phalanx adapted in real time. Spears aimed not at the thick hide of the animals, but at the exposed mahouts and at the elephants' feet and trunks. Wounded and panicked, some of the great beasts began to turn. And that is where the battle became almost apocalyptic. Elephants driven mad with pain no longer distinguished friend from enemy. Several turned and trampled straight through their own ranks, crushing the very soldiers they were meant to protect. The field dissolved into chaos on both sides, screaming animals, collapsing formations, men fighting in a red slurry of mud and blood. In the middle of all of it, Porus did something that set him apart from every enemy Alexander had ever faced. He did not retreat to safety. He rode his own massive elephant straight into the thick of the fighting, visible to every soldier on that field, refusing to abandon his men even as the battle turned catastrophic around him. Wound after wound struck him, arrows, javelins, and still he did not fall, and still he did not run. Think about what that must have looked like to Alexander's men. They had crossed an ocean and a continent chasing the story of an emperor who fled at the first sign of danger. Now they faced a king who would rather die on the back of an elephant than turn his back on his own soldiers. Eventually, weakened, surrounded, his army collapsing into chaos, Porus's elephant faltered, and the fighting around him finally ended. Bleeding from multiple wounds, he was captured. He was brought before Alexander, and what happened next became one of the most famous exchanges in ancient history. Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Porus, still standing as tall as his wounds allowed, answered simply, "Like a king treats another king." Something in that answer struck Alexander harder than almost anything else in the entire campaign. Rather than executing him or stripping his throne, Alexander restored Porus's kingdom, expanded it even further, and made him an ally instead of a prisoner. It was one of the rare moments in the whole campaign where raw courage earned an enemy something Alexander almost never gave: genuine respect. But this victory cost more than any before it. The battle had been brutal, the costliest of Alexander's career, worse than Granicus, worse than Issus, worse even than Gaugamela against a far larger army. And somewhere in that chaos, Bucephalus died, the horse that had carried Alexander since he was a boy, through every major battle of his life. The companion who had carried him from boyhood to the edge of the world was gone. Whether from wounds or simple exhaustion after years of relentless campaigning, accounts differ, but Alexander was reportedly devastated, and in his grief he founded a city on the spot and named it Bucephala, so the horse's name would outlive them both. And then came a moment that had nothing to do with elephants, rivers, or enemy kings. Alexander wanted to keep going. Beyond the Hydaspes lay more of India, more kingdoms, lands rumored to be richer than anything he had faced so far. He began preparing his army to push toward the Ganges. His refused. For the first time in 8 years, the soldiers who had crossed rivers under arrow fire, who had charged directly at Persian kings, who had marched through deserts and monsoon storms without question, simply stopped. They gathered at the Hydaspes river and told their king, a man who had never lost a single battle, that they would go no further. Years of war. Thousands from home. Men who hadn't seen their families in nearly a decade. The bloodshed against Porus had shown them something none of them wanted to say out loud, that even Alexander's genius couldn't make war painless forever, and that somewhere beyond this river might wait a battle even he could not survive. Alexander argued. Ancient sources say he retreated to his tent for days, refusing to speak to anyone, hoping loyalty or shame would change their minds. It didn't. For the first time in his life, Alexander the Great was forced to turn back. Looking at the full arc of this campaign, the Hydaspes stands apart from everything before it. Granicus proved he could survive Persia's opening blow. Issus proved he could break an emperor face to face. Gaugamela proved he could shatter the largest empire on earth in a single afternoon. But the Hydaspes proved something else, something almost tragic. It proved that even Alexander's seemingly limitless will had a boundary, not one drawn by an enemy king, but by the exhaustion of the very men who had made every previous victory possible. Porus fought differently than anyone before him, and in doing so revealed something 8 years of unbroken victory never had. The limits of how far ambition alone could carry an army before the men behind it finally said no more. It was the day Alexander won his bloodiest battle, and lost, for the first time, the one thing that had carried him from a riverbank in Asia Minor to the edge of India, the unquestioning will of his own soldiers to keep marching into the unknown behind him.